Chapter 41, Diabetes and Genetics. And this is specific training for the diabetes sensor, the genetic test for diabetes. You will find this test here in the overview, and it is specifically for diabetes mellitus type 2, so the age-related diabetes people call it. And it has a number of functions. It's useful for prevention, so it will help you prevent the disease. It's good for early diagnosis. It will help you diagnose it in time and get treatment in case it develops, and it will help improve the treatment. Now let's look at the concept of blood sugar regulation. Here we have the inside of the intestine where the food ends up. Then we have the bloodstream, and blood sugar is glucose. So we've got glucose sugar in here. It's a very small type of sugar, and here we have the liver. Now, something with carbohydrates is eaten, and the carbohydrate is broken down into small sugars like glucose, and glucose is then taken up from the intestine. This causes too much sugar to be in the bloodstream, and sugar is very important, especially glucose is important for cells as a fuel. Too little sugar lets them die because they just run out of fuel, but too much is also toxic. So the body has developed a system where the excessive glucose is absorbed into the liver. The body just recognizes, oops, there's too much glucose. It secretes insulin, and insulin then causes the glucose to be absorbed into the liver. And that lowers the blood sugar again. So even if we eat something with sugar, it goes into the blood, but it's absorbed into the liver to keep the blood sugar in the normal range. Now, then we haven't eaten for a long time, and we're using up some sugar because we do some sports, or the cells use them up through metabolism. That will cause the blood level or the blood sugar level to go down, and that is also dangerous. So the body has another hormone, the opposite of insulin, called glucagon, and this causes glucose from the liver to be secreted into the bloodstream again. Now this is the normal process. And this regulation of blood sugar, when it goes too low, you need to increase it. When it goes too high, you need to decrease it. This regulation is very important to keep the blood sugar always in the right range. And this usually works quite well in most people, but with increasing age and with certain genetic variations, this control can get out of control, basically. And this is when type 2 diabetes is generated. So it's a poor control of blood sugar. So here's what happens in a diabetic. The glucose, the carbohydrates are converted to glucose. Glucose goes into the bloodstream. Then the body recognizes, oops, there's too much glucose, and it secretes insulin. However, insulin has very little effect because the body has become insulin resistant. So this just doesn't work as well anymore. So not enough glucose is absorbed into the liver, and you have too high blood sugar, very unhealthy. And these are the genes that are involved in this. 9 genes that influence it, and each of them, by the way, if this table doesn't mean anything to you, do check the training for simple disease risk statistics that will explain it to you in detail. Just to summarize, this is the gene, this is the catalog number for the genetic variation, this is some scientific stuff, this is the actual genetic results. So both genes of this type have a C at this position. An odds ratio, again, you will learn about this in the simple disease risk statistics, but here the odds ratio is 1.38, so it's a 38% higher risk, 65% higher risk, normal risk, actually lower risk, so this is protective, and so on. This is all scientific for the customer or the patient to understand it more easily. We have created this bar here, so it can be anywhere from the protection, meaning lower risk than the general population. Average risk means the same risk as everybody else, or increased risk, so a higher risk of developing the disease. And especially if you're here in the increased risk area, it's very important for the person to know you have a much higher risk than the general population. This prevention is much more important for you than it is for everybody else. And we find that this really motivates high-risk individuals to follow their preventive advice to stay healthy much more rigorously. And so this here is the the general risk of diabetes. And then we know through genetics a lot about how different therapies would work and some other things. For example, some people tend to require, when they develop diabetes mellitus type 2, to require insulin earlier. And insulin is the hormone that you need to inject. That's the last stage of diabetes before you can usually modify the blood sugar with certain drugs, if not lifestyle interventions. But some people just respond less to those drugs and require insulin more quickly. In this case, it's normal, so you wouldn't expect this person to require insulin as quickly. Then there's a glibenclamide blood sugar reducer. It's in this case effective. It could also be less effective due to genetic variations. Tolbutamide is ineffective, so if you choose between those two drugs, in this case I would use the one that is genetically expected to be more effective rather than the ineffective one. Glimepiride is less effective, and metformin is less effective, and generally the sulfonylurea drugs would be more effective. So what you can do here is you can check how effective you would expect the drug to be according to genetics, and start with those drugs first. And thereby you can really improve the effectiveness of the treatment and slow disease progression. And this here is the science behind the genes. In case, as I said, in case you don't know what this table means, do watch Simple Disease Risk Statistics. Here you see two Cs. 55% of the population have a C on every one of the copies of this gene, have no increased risk, and insulin is not required sooner. TT has 10% of the population. They have a 2.77-fold risk, so 177% higher risk than people with the optimal genetic type, and also insulin substitution is required sooner. Here's the science behind it in case you're interested. This is the next gene, so 3% have a 1.94% risk and so on. There's another gene, 70% have no increased risk, 50% have a 1.21% risk, and 33% have a 1.44% risk, and so on. And here's actually protections, a lower risk in some people and a higher risk in other genetic types. And this is something that you can look into. If you're interested in the reports, you will find this kind of information for every one of the genes. There's the science behind it. So in case you're interested how we come up with the claims of increased risk, this is where you can look. And that's the end of chapter 41, Diabetes and Genetics as specific training for the diabetes sensor.